I'm going to try to show you as much as I can about Bubble and how it works in 30 minutes. Let's go. All Bubble apps start here, create an app, give it a name. Don't worry about a template just for now. And we're in. You can go through this assistant if you want. I'm going to skip it. Right, Bubble is what they call what you see is what you get kind of editor. You've got all these kind of visual elements over here. I can put a big text on the screen that says something like hello world. And I can change how it looks. There's some pre-built styles here, or I can get really granular if I want to. And if I want to see how this actually looks out on the internet, I hit this preview button. And you see here, this is my actual application on the internet as it works right now. Here's the URL. You can see I've got this funny toolbar down the bottom. That's the debugger. That's beyond the scope of what we can talk about right now. You can just remove this little part of the URL here, and that will go away so you can see how this looks. So you can right now just share this with your mum, right? You could say, hi mum. And if you make a change like this, when you go to your preview, you'll see this banner. You got to click on that because your app's changed, and now here's the new version. So in the most basic form, you can just drag things around the page like this. I could drag a button onto here, something that says like confirm, change the color of it. You can see that as I add stuff to the page here, it also appears here on the left-hand side in what we call the elements tree. This is just like a real-time map of all of the different things, elements, that we actually place onto our page. So this is all fine and well, but where things get more interesting is when we actually add some degree of interactivity to our app. One of the ways that we do that is with input. So if I add a simple input here that says, I can add sort of a placeholder text. And if I go and preview this app right now, you see I can actually type something in here. Now, what's really, really cool about Bubble is just how easy it is to have dynamic information, information that the user can add to our application, show up in other parts of our app. So for example, this input here, right? I can set the source of this text rather than something static that I just type here. I can actually click this little magical button here that says insert dynamic data. And I can say what I want to actually appear in this text is going to come from somewhere else in my application. So I can say I actually want it to come from this input and the value inside of that input. So if I do that and then preview my app again, I can type in here, hi mum, and you see that it actually changes. Now this isn't necessarily a useful feature to your users, but what if I could actually store this information somewhere and show it at a later time? Like for example, any kind of classic to-do or task manager app, right? So if I actually change this, I'm going to right click and go clear all, and I'm going to say create a task. This is just going to serve as like a header. And this place where I'm going to change this to say my task name. What I actually want to do is when this button is clicked, I actually want to save this task so I can do something with it later. So to do that, to kind of add interactivity and behavior to our application, we use something called workflows. They're over in a different part of the editor here, over on the left. Now, at the time of recording this, Bubble is kind of between two different designs for this workflow tab. I'm going to go to the beta for the new design because that's what's going to be used moving forward. If you're watching this video in the future, then you won't see that button. You're just going to see this new design tab for the workflows by default. So we want to click up here, new workflow. And each workflow starts with an event. This is like the trigger. So when this thing happens, then we want to have this series of actions that happen after that. So the trigger event, right, that we want to happen here could be something like when our button is clicked. So there's all kinds of different trigger events that we can choose from. I want to go an element is clicked just to demonstrate this, right? And then here we choose the element on the page, which is the one that's going to be clicked to trigger this event. So I can go here, button confirm. And then if we click here, we can see all the different types of actions that Bubble gives us. So these are all things that will happen after this button is clicked. So I could do something like really silly, and I could just say, oh, hide my input. So when I click this button here, the input disappears, right? That's like the fundamentals of workflows. So this isn't actually that useful, right? So I'm going to delete this. What we want to happen is actually save the value that's inside of this input inside of what we call the database so that we can pull it out and do something with it later. So for us to do that, we first need to actually design this thing called a task. We need to decide like what bits of information does a task actually have, right? Does it have like a title, a description, a due date, the user who it was assigned to, right? A data type, as we call it, can have all of these different properties. So to configure that, we go to this tab here called data. You can see there's already one default data type called a user. It has a one property called an email. Just going to ignore the user for now. We want to create a new data type, right? Which we're going to call a task. So once we've created that, you can see over here, we've got this button called create a new field, right? A field is an attribute, right? It's a piece of information attached to a particular type of thing. So a user might have a name, a last name, an email, etc. A task, as I said, might have a title, a description, a due date, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to click here to create a new field. And let's say that we actually do want to add a title here. We add what that field is called, and then we want to say what type of data actually lives in here, right? Because a field, a piece of information, can be encoded, so to speak, in lots of different formats, right? So something like the title, that makes sense as text, right? It's just sort of a plain text value. But if we thought about something like, okay, whether or not this task is completed, that's kind of a value, a piece of information that's either going to be yes or it's going to be no. It's going to be true or it's going to be false. And that true or false is another type of data, or different encoding for that information that we have access to. So if I have a field here which is called is complete, and you can give a question mark after it to make it really clear, there's another data type here called a yes or a no field, right? And then again, like a due date, right? A due date, that actually has a field as well that we can use called a date. If we were gonna, for each user, save their age, that could be another type called a number. And each of these different types of information, right, the different data types that we have, you can manipulate them in different ways depending on what type of thing that it is. If it's a number, right, you can actually use it in mathematical expressions. If it's a date, you can actually add hours and minutes to it. So there's different sort of transformations that you can do to different pieces of data depending on what they are. Okay, so now we have this thing called a task. If we go over to our app data field, this is like opening up a spreadsheet that has all of the different data types that we've configured in it. So here is our spreadsheet for tasks, right? And you can see that each row is empty. I could just go in here and I could just fill this out and I could say, okay, this task is like walk the dog, right? By default, no, it's not complete. And I could just add in some value here. And you can see that there it is. There's this single row now in my database, right? Within this table, this spreadsheet of tasks. But obviously you don't want to be configuring and adding all of these manually, right? You want to provide an interface, a page in your application where users can actually add all of this information themselves. So this essentially means we want to create a form in our application for adding this information, right? Now, forgetting about is complete and due date, let's just see how we can actually get a user to add information from our interface and populate our database from what they give us in that interface. So that's going to mean we come back to workflows. When this button confirm is clicked, we have this really, really handy action called create a new thing. And create a new thing means nothing more than add a new row in a particular table, right? Add a new row in our database for a particular data type. So right now we've got two data types. We've got that user, right? And we've got a task. Now, when we do create a new thing, we don't actually have access to the user. That's actually, funnily enough, a different action called create an account for somebody else or sign the user up. We have dedicated actions for users. Let's say that tasks can belong to different teams. Well, you'd see now that when I create a new thing, I'm going to choose between task and a team. So let's choose task. And this is when we're creating a new entry in our task table. Now we're going to say, okay, so what are the values for each of those properties or fields that a task can have? So I click here to set another field, and I'm going to choose what field that I want to set. So for now, just to demonstrate, I want to set the title. And I could just say some static value here, like here is a new task. And if I go into my bubble preview here, it doesn't actually matter if I add any information here or not. Remember, when I click this button confirm, all that's going to happen is we're going to create a new task with this title, here is a new task. So if I click this, you actually saw nothing happen visually on the screen. Nothing was configured to happen visually on the screen. Something was configured to happen in the background in our database. And I can prove that by going to the data tab, app data. And if we go now to our tasks table, you can see there's a new row, a new entry with this title, here is a new task. But obviously that's not very interesting. We want this value here to come from the value of this input. So that's where we return to this concept of dynamic data, okay? So this button here is triggering a workflow. And as a shortcut, when you're in Bubble, you can actually just click the element in question and go edit workflow. That will take you to the associated workflow or create it if it doesn't already exist. And instead of having this static value here, okay, I actually want to click Insert Dynamic Data. We're going to populate this title field with some information that the user is giving us through this input. So that means I just have to select that input. That's the source where this data is coming from. At this stage, we've just selected the element itself, which has a few other different properties. The actual property that we're interested in is the value. That's the information that's actually being inputted into this input. Then I can have a new action here afterwards, which is called reset relevant inputs, which is just going to wipe the value so that a user can use this input a second time without having to reload the page. So if I go here, walk the dog, hit confirm. If I go now into my database, you can see there's a new entry called walk the dog. If I have another one here called race the cat, because why not? Then you can see it appears within our database. Okay, so that's interesting, but where this gets actually interesting is where we then give this information back to the user and allow them to interact with it in some way. So we've pushed data into our database. How do we retrieve data and pull it out back into our interface so that users can interact with it? Well, what I'm going to use here to demonstrate is something called a repeating group. And a repeating group is just a way to visualize information that's in our database. It's a way to take multiple rows from a table in our database, multiple entries for a particular data type, and render them out to the user within our page that we design. So I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to click up here. You can rename every element. I'm going to call this repeating group tasks. You can see it renamed it here as well within the elements tree. And here we say which table in the database do we want to pull into this repeating group. That's what type of content means. So for us, that's going to be a task, right? And the data source, right? This is saying, okay, which specific tasks do you want me to look for? So we've got this lovely expression called do a search for. And by default, if I just select task here, right? This is searching for all the tasks that we have, right? There's no what we call search constraints, filters. There's nothing of the equivalent of only get tasks that were created yesterday or only get tasks that have the word dog in them, only get tasks where the due date is 2 weeks from now, right? You can do all of that stuff, but by default, this is just grabbing all the tasks that exist in our database. And we've got some other configuration options here related to like how this repeating group is going to display itself. I'm just going to turn this off for now, the fixed number of rows. So this repeating group will render like a table. It will create a number of rows, one for each task, one for each entry that it retrieved from the database. And then what I can do, I use the first line here in this repeating group, right? This first row to basically design how this row is going to look for each item in the repeating group. So if I said here, I am a task, you see that's going to be rendered multiple times. I want to show you how that looks right away now. Okay, here you can see there's 4 lines here, 4 entries, and they each say, I am a task, I am a task, I am a task. All right, and that's because this repeating group is rendering a single row for each task that it's found in the database. Each task that has been returned from this search query, right? From this search for tasks that we configured. And of course, if we go into our data, this app data tab shows us all of the data for all of the data types that we've got in our app. You can see there are actually 4 entries. If I was to delete one of these, I can click it here and go delete. As you'd expect, now there's actually only 3 lines in this repeating group. But this obviously isn't really useful information. What would be more useful for us is if this text element, instead of just showing some static value, it showed the title for the task in the corresponding row. And so because this text here is inside of a repeating group, you can see here that I'm not seeing 3 text entries here. I'm just seeing 1 because I only configure the elements, the design for this first row, and then that row repeats for each entry that the repeating group is going to retrieve from the database, right? You define kind of one group structure, and then that group structure repeats as many times as necessary. So just to show you that in practice, if I change this value now with insert dynamic data, that wonderful expression that we've seen before, I can actually here choose the current cell's task. So Bubble is intelligent enough to expose that to us. It knows that this row in the repeating group actually has a task inside of it. And I can choose to display here some piece of information through this text element that corresponds to this row in the repeating group, or as the repeating group terminology uses, cell, right? These are each a cell in the repeating group. So now you'll see that as I refresh the page here, I'm actually seeing now 3 tasks that I created. And now you can see kind of the true power of Bubble, because right now I could say something like edit this video, and it will show up right away in our repeating group. So we've created kind of like a full stack application, as it's so to speak, on one page, where we are taking information from a web page, an interface from the user, saving that into a database, a repository of information, and then have somewhere where we can display that information back out to the user within the interface. Right, now one of the things, if you're gonna follow along, you're gonna find very quickly is that if I try to add more information to this repeating group, you can see how like I can't actually drag it around. Like I can drag these around and I can't drag these around. And so I show you that, I'm gonna just undo this. So I show you that really, really clearly. I'm gonna move these guys all over here. Right here, I've got a group which I'm gonna call group fixed. And I just wanna make sure that on this layout tab, I've got this thing called a container layout set to fixed, okay? And all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate this group. So I'm just gonna copy it and then paste. And I'm gonna call this a group column, okay? Now watch as I add elements to these groups, right? If I add a button here, you see I can just drag it around. If I add a button here, see how it snaps to the top left? If I add another one, see how it just snaps? I give it a different color so you can see. It just snaps to the top left. This is due to something called the responsive settings. Now this is too short of a video to go into this in detail, but basically if we've got a fixed layout, we're defining where the elements should be on the page, just based on where we drag them. It's essentially an X and Y coordinate for where each element should be on the page. With a responsive layout, we're defining where elements should be relative to other elements on the page. So this group here, which essentially we call the parent container, that defines the rules for how the elements inside, the children elements, should arrange themselves. So because it's set to a column, that essentially means that anything that I add here will be stacked on top of one another. If I set this layout to be a row, right, then you see that they'll be stacked alongside each other. And between these two settings, you basically have the flexibility that you need to be able to make a page work on different screen sizes, and particularly right on a large screen like I'm using now, but also on a mobile screen. And so if I come over and I add a new page here, so just call this like my mobile page, and I'll get back into pages in a moment. And so what I can actually do here is for this page itself, which is a container, right, which holds other elements. If I set this to be a row, and let's say that I have a bunch of buttons on the page. See, I've got this fit width to content. That basically means that I can type label here and the button is gonna expand as it needs to be to fit that content. I'll add one more just to demonstrate this. If I go over to this responsive tab here, right, you can actually change this to change the screen size, and you can see how the elements on the page are gonna arrange themselves differently depending on the screen size. You can see that as the page gets smaller, they can't all fit horizontally. So what happens is they start to stack underneath each other instead. And there's a whole bunch of different rules and configuration that you have available for configuring the rules for how these elements should arrange themselves depending on the page size. I'm not going to go into it here, but that basic principle allows you to then design pages that work on multiple screen sizes. Right, now back on our index page, the next concept that I want to show you is something that we call conditional formatting. Right? So let's say this button here that we've got inside of each of these repeating groups says something called complete, and this is going to mark a task as completed or not. So what I can do is on this button, I can click add workflow. That's just like a shortcut for selecting new workflow, selecting an element as clicked, and then selecting that particular element. All right, so I'm going to remove this example event that I just created, and it's this button complete that we're looking at. Now, because this button exists inside of a repeating group cell, just like this text element, it has access to the data underneath. It has access to the data inside of this repeating group cell. And so what I can do is I can actually use an action called make changes to a thing, right? This is going to modify an existing entry in the database. It's the same thing as me going in here and edit this video, marking this as complete and hitting save. But we're instead exposing the ability for our users to manipulate that data through an interface that we design for them, right? So going back into this workflow, make changes to a thing, we first select the thing that we want to change. And as I said, because this button exists within the context of a repeating group cell, we have access to the data within that cell, which is of course a task. So we're going to choose which field that we want to modify. In our case, we want to modify this is complete field, and we'll make that set to yes. Right now, if I just click this, you can probably guess what happens. Like nothing's going to happen on the page. But if we go into our database and I refresh this data, you can see that task I just clicked on now says is complete. And this is interesting because now I can actually treat each of these rows of data differently depending on the data for that particular row or for that particular task. And how I do that is with something called conditional statements. So within each element, you've got this tab here called conditional. And this is basically defining the rules for how this particular element should behave, depending on the state of other data on the page, right? Or in our case, depending on the state of the data within this repeating group cell. So as before, I can access that current cell's task, and I can basically write a rule, right? A rule that is going to equate to a yes or a no, or rather like an if or an else statement. So if the current cell's task, or as Bubble puts it, when the current cell's task is complete field is equal to yes, right? In that case, I don't really want this button to say complete. I want it to say something else. So I'm going to change the value for this label field to say mark as incomplete. And what's more, I can add an extra property that I want to change. And in my case, I just want to change the background color. Instead of that blue, let's just set it to yellow, right? And right here, I'm just choosing some predefined colors. I'll get to that in a minute. So right now you can see immediately that the one task that is actually complete looks different than the rest. And that's because of this conditional statement that we just configured. And in real time now, when I click on one of these buttons, what happens is it makes the corresponding change in the database and then responds to that new conditional statement that we just configured, which says that the button label and color should be changed. Now, what if I wanted to actually configure the logic to mark these tasks as incomplete? Like I'm clicking on these now and nothing's happening, it seems. If I click on them and I go into the database, like they're still going to be marked if I refresh. They're still going to be marked as completed. See, I've got two branches of logic here that we need to handle. If the task is incomplete and I click the button, I want to set the task to be completed. If the task is completed and I click the same button, we'll now mark it as incompleted. And so just like we wrote a conditional statement within this conditional tab, which is defining basically how elements should react to changes within data on the page, I can actually add those same conditional statements to workflows. So on this button complete is clicked, I actually want to add a condition here. This is actually, I only want this event to fire if that is complete field for the task is no. So basically, is that task incomplete? If it is, then mark it as complete. And then I want to have the inverse event. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click over here and I'm going to go copy. And then it's a little bit unintuitive right now with Bubble. I'm going to click it again and hit paste. So now I've got two workflows attached to the same button. But on the second one, I want to change it a little bit. Now I want the inverse condition. When the task is already complete, that's what this condition says. In that case, then I want to set this is complete field to no. How this actually works is basically only one of these events is ever going to be fired. And I'm going to hit the preview button here to bring back the debugger, which is a really helpful tool here to allow us to incrementally go through the logic as it's being executed in real time to see what's happening. So I'm going to hit the step-by-step button. And if I go here on here as a new task and I hit this, you can actually see here how this workflow is being evaluated. So this is one of the events that we just configured, button complete is clicked, and it's only going to fire when the task underneath is incomplete, okay? In our case, this task is completed, right? Here is a new task, it's completed. So this red means that this condition evaluated to false. This condition was not true, right? It was not correct. So if I hit run next, we actually now have moved to the next event that we configured. And in this case, the condition that we wrote is green, which means that it's evaluating to true. The current cell's tasks is complete field, right? The value of that field is yes right now. In other words, the task within this cell was complete when we hit this button. You see it's already triggered there underneath, right? Bubble actually can make those changes faster than the debugger picks them up. So this is going to be executed, and then we make changes to that task as before, where we set that is complete field to no. Okay, so if I set the debugger now to normal, you can see this operating in real time. We can change these tasks to complete as incomplete, just as we need. One of the other features that we probably want is only to show the incomplete tasks. And so if I just mark these all as complete for now, I'm going to change the search logic for this repeating group. Remember earlier we set this to basically be set so that all the tasks in our database are going to be pulled into this repeating group. Well, now I actually want to change this. I want to add what's called a search constraint, right? And a search constraint is basically exactly what it says on the tin. It's a filter, right? If you're going into Airbnb and you're only looking for properties that are available within 2 certain dates, right? You only want to see those properties and you want to filter out everything that's not available for those dates. So in our case, we basically add a search constraint as an expression, right, that can evaluate to yes or no. So in our case, we're saying, okay, look at the is complete field, and we only want to see tasks where that is complete field is equal to no. In other words, we only want to see incomplete tasks. I also have the ability to sort these, right? And I can sort them by when they were created. So you can see here in the database that this here is a new task was the first one that was created. It's actually appearing here at the top of the list. That's like the default sorting. But if I set this created date and I set descending to yes, that basically means that the most recently created task is going to appear at the top. So if I refresh this, you can obviously see the sorting is now different, but also watch what happens as I click on each of these tasks. So I click here on race the cat and it disappears, walk the dog and it disappears. And that's because in real time, the search constraint is operating on these tasks, which if I refresh this, you can see here that 2 of these are now set to no, and they're being filtered out from this repeating group expression. Right, we're nearing the end here. Last few things I want to touch on. We talked here about the fact that we can choose any arbitrary styling properties for the elements on my page. You have these things called styles, and these are just predefined combinations of styling properties, right? Like font and line spacing, color, the type of border that you're going to have. It's a predefined combination of things that you can just quickly have a degree of consistency throughout your application so that you're not individually changing the font size for every element on your page. You're just choosing from these predefined options, a library of options that you control. They live here within the styles tab. And you can see here you have different styles for all kinds of different elements. So for my text, here's all the different styles that I have for text, all the different headers. And you can see here that this is where I actually configure what the individual properties are for this style. So if this text has the heading 3 style, if I change that to have a font color of green, well, now anywhere in the application that I have a text that's tied to that style or using that style, it's just going to now inherit the new properties from that style. I don't have to go and change all the individual elements in my page, which makes building applications a lot easier, and particularly easier to maintain a degree of design consistency throughout your application. We also have something called plugins for Bubble. These are ways that extend the functionality of what an app can do beyond just the native capabilities that Bubble gives you. The vast majority of these are created by members of the community. They actually write the code to implement these plugins, which essentially means that you can extend your Bubble application to virtually anything that any other kind of application can do. All right, so for example, I'm going to show you one of my favorite plugins, this Toast Notifications by Minimum Studio. So if I install that, it gives me some instructions for how it works. There's also often a plugin page that gives more information about how it works. And it tells me that the things that I get with this plugin. So I get one specific type of element and one specific type of action. So if I come here to my visual elements, I now have this element called notifier. I just have to put that somewhere on my page. And this is configuring the style properties for basically an alert that can show up when stuff happens. I'm not going to get into the details of how this specific plugin works, but just to show you, if I go into my confirm or create task workflow here, right, I can add in an action here that this plugin has exposed to me. And I'm going to look it up by notify. That's what this action is called. And this action takes some parameters, right? It takes some information that it's going to use when it executes its own behavior. And so the message in this case is just going to be task created. And if I go and preview this now, install plugin, and I hit confirm, you can see we get this nice little notification, right? So this isn't a Bubble native element or a Bubble native feature. This is something that a member of the community, or in this case, a particular agency that works with Bubble, they created this plugin and allowed me to have access to it within my application. Now, we touched on this briefly before, but you have different pages within your application. So if I've got a new page here called the task, this is my task page. There's all sorts of different ways that you can use pages, right? But I can say that I want this task page to have a particular type of content. So this task page itself is essentially going to be attached or connected or linked to a particular data type that I have in my database. And that means that I can now do something like have a big header text here, which is going to, as the dynamic source for this text, it can take the current page's task. Just like we use the current cell within a repeating group, we essentially got this page, which is configured to hold a single task, and it can now pull data out of that task and render it or do something with it. So the current page task's title is what I actually want to display here within this header. And so now we can do something like on our index page here, if I just add another button that says open, and by the way, I just hit Control Command D on my keyboard there to duplicate this button. So let's say this is going to go open. What I can do here is I can now go to this new task page that I created and send along with it a particular task. So in our case, I basically want to click open on one of these tasks and now see the full information in a standalone page for that particular task. And so what I'll do is I'll go on navigation, go to page, and now I can choose that new task page that I created. There's some default pages that come here with every Bubble app, which I'm not going to get into. And what I'm going to send to this task page, where it says data to send, and we've got this little red entry, that basically means this is required. And you can see over here, we've got one issue. Bubble tracks the issues, right? The things that need to be resolved in our application. It tracks those in real time. So you can click on this and we can say, see, one issue to fix. Go to page task, remember to fill out, right, this entry here because it's not going to work otherwise. So here I can just choose, as I could before, because this button is inside of a repeating group cell, right? I can access the task underneath. I can choose here the current cell's task. And for fun, we'll open it in a new tab as well. And so now if I click over here, you can see that I'm opening a new page with the task information on it. Edit this video, I can open that one too, and it will open that task page. All right, so that's Bubble. If you want to keep learning, check out some of the other videos here on my YouTube channel, or check out my Bubble course if you want a step-by-step guided flow to go from zero to hero as quickly as you can. Check out the link in the description for that. Otherwise, happy bubbling.